I heard my neighbor crying through the wall. What I did next changed both our lives. The first time I heard her crying, it cut through the thin apartment wall like a blade, sharp and helpless. The kind of sound that makes your chest tighten before your mind can catch up. It was late morning, sunlight pouring through my curtains in pale gold stripes, and for a moment I wondered if the sound was coming from my own thoughts. But then it came again, softer this time, trembling as if someone was trying to hold themselves together and failing. I stood still in my kitchen, coffee growing cold in my hand, realizing the crying was coming from the apartment next door. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know her story, but I knew in that instant that whatever was happening behind that wall was about to change my life in ways I couldn't imagine. Before the story goes any further, if you believe that kindness can change lives and that everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel Touch of Kindness. Your support helps these stories reach hearts that need them most. I had moved into the building only 3 months earlier, a narrow sunlit complex tucked between a grocery store and a small park where children played under wide trees during the day. My life at that point was simple, almost painfully quiet. My name is Aaron Whitmore, and I worked from home as a freelance editor, spending most days alone with words on a screen and the distant sounds of the city drifting in through open windows. I liked the quiet, or at least I told myself I did. After losing my younger brother in an accident 2 years before, silence felt safer than conversation, and solitude felt easier than explaining grief to people who didn't know how to listen. The woman next door had moved in about 2 weeks before the crying started. I'd seen her once in the hallway, struggling with a cardboard box that looked heavier than she expected. She had dark hair pulled into a loose knot, tired eyes, and a kind of distracted politeness that suggested she had too much on her mind to focus on small talk. We exchanged a brief smile, the kind neighbors give each other when they don't yet know whether they'll ever truly meet. After that, I heard her footsteps sometimes during the day, light and quick, and the sound of drawers opening and closing as if she were searching for something she couldn't find. The crying didn't happen at night, which somehow made it harder to ignore. It came during the day when the world outside was loud and alive, when sunlight made everything seem normal. That morning, it went on for several minutes, fading in and out, until finally it stopped. I stood there long after, staring at the wall between us, feeling like a witness to something intimate and fragile. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. People cry, people have bad days, but the sound stayed with me, echoing in my head as I tried to focus on work. Over the next few days, the crying returned. Sometimes it was quiet and controlled. Other times it was raw, the kind that shakes the air and makes breathing uneven. Each time it came during daylight hours, usually late morning or early afternoon. I started to adjust my schedule without realizing it, pausing my work whenever I heard it, sitting still as if movement might somehow make it worse. I imagined 100 different reasons for her tears: loss, illness, loneliness, fear. None of them felt impossible. One afternoon, as I stepped out to check my mail, I saw her sitting on the stairs outside the building, her face turned toward the sun, but her eyes distant and hollow. Her name, I would soon learn, was Marin Calloway. She looked smaller somehow, folded in on herself, hands clenched in her lap. For a moment, I considered walking past, pretending I hadn't noticed. It would have been easier, but the memory of that crying sound pushed me forward, and before I could overthink it, I sat down a few steps away. We didn't speak much that day. There were no dramatic confessions or sudden revelations. We exchanged a few careful sentences, the kind people use when they're testing the ground beneath their feet. She mentioned she was new to the city, that things had been harder than she expected. I told her I worked from home, and that the building took some getting used to. When we parted, she thanked me for sitting with her, and the gratitude in her eyes felt heavier than the words themselves. The crying didn't stop after that, but it changed. It grew quieter, more restrained, as if she were trying not to let it escape. That somehow made it worse. One day, I heard a dull thud through the wall, followed by silence so thick it made my heart race. I knocked on her door without thinking, my hand trembling. When she opened it, her eyes were red, her face pale, and for a split second, she looked startled, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice she existed at all. Over the next week, Marin's story unfolded in pieces, never all at once, always cautiously. She had left an abusive relationship, one that had slowly eroded her sense of self until she barely recognized the person she'd become. She'd moved to this city with a suitcase, a small savings that was already running thin, and a hope that distance might help her heal. But trauma doesn't stay behind just because you change locations. It followed her, settling into her days, whispering reminders of fear and failure when she least expected them. I didn't know how to fix any of it. I wasn't a therapist or a hero. I was just a neighbor with too much quiet and a past that still hurt. But I could listen. I could bring her a cup of tea in the afternoon, or sit with her on the building steps while the sun warmed the concrete and the sounds of the park drifted over. I could remind her in small, consistent ways that she wasn't invisible anymore. Slowly, the atmosphere between our apartments changed. The crying became less frequent. In its place, I heard music sometimes, soft and tentative at first, then louder, more confident. I heard her laughter one afternoon, sudden and surprised, as if she hadn't expected it herself. I began to realize how much the sound of her pain had affected me, how it had cracked open parts of my own grief that I'd kept sealed for years. Helping Marin forced me to confront my own avoidance of connection. I had built my life around not needing anyone, around convincing myself that independence meant strength. But sitting beside her, watching her struggle to rebuild something that had been shattered, I understood that isolation had been a shield, not a solution. Kindness, I learned, doesn't always arrive as a grand gesture. Sometimes it's just the willingness to hear someone cry and not turn away. One bright afternoon, the kind where the sky looks impossibly blue and everything feels briefly lighter, Marin knocked on my door. She looked different, not completely healed, not magically transformed, but steadier. She told me she'd found a part-time job at a local bookstore, that it wasn't much, but it felt like a beginning. She said she was thinking about taking a class, something creative, something just for herself. As she spoke, I realized how proud I felt, and how strange that was to feel such pride for someone who had been a stranger not long ago. That day marked a quiet turning point. The crying stopped altogether after that. The wall between our apartments no longer felt like a barrier holding back sorrow. It felt thin in a different way, like a reminder of how close lives can be without ever truly touching. We continued to share moments small and ordinary. Morning greetings in the hallway, afternoons on the steps, the kind of neighborly connection that doesn't demand anything but offers more than you expect. In helping Marin find her footing, I found some of my own. I started leaving my apartment more often, taking walks in the park during the day, letting sunlight and movement soften the edges of my grief. I spoke about my brother for the first time in years, not as a wound, but as a memory that still mattered. Marin listened the way I had listened to her, with patience and respect, and I realized that kindness, once given, has a way of circling back. The day she told me she was ready to move to a new place, one closer to her work, I felt a surprising ache, not loss exactly, but the recognition that something meaningful was changing. We stood outside in the afternoon sun, the building casting long shadows, and I knew that even if we didn't remain part of each other's daily lives, what we'd shared would stay with me. Before this story ends, I want to ask you something. Sometimes, listening is enough to heal two broken hearts at once.